Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum and I am here today at Limex with a very cool, very rare World War I Italian semi-automatic carbine. I think a lot of people believe this is a submachine gun. It's not, it's actually semi-auto only. This is a Beretta model of 1918 and the backstory on it is really cool. And honestly, if I had to go into World War I and pick a weapon, this would be really high on my list of potential World War I firearms to carry because this is actually really cool and really nice, and we'll get into why. So, the story begins in 1915 when Italy adopts the Villar Perosa, which you're probably familiar with, but here's a photo if you're not. It is sort of technically a submachine gun in that it is select fire and pistol caliber, but it's really a pistol caliber scaled down sort of emplaced machine gun. It's a dual barrel, spade gripped, magazine fed, tripod mounted gun. Pistol machine gun is the direct translation of its designation in Italian, and that actually makes a lot of sense. What it doesn't do is make a whole lot of practical utility in combat. There are some applications for it up in the high mountains where getting a larger rifle caliber heavy machine gun into a position could be really difficult and where ranges can be very short. There are some applications to it, but it is not a good general purpose weapon. And by 1916, this kind of becomes clear, and Villar Perosa experiments with the idea of converting it into an actual shoulder-fired, sort of a conventional shoulder-fired weapon. This is the OVP model of 1918, sort of post-dated, designated, don't worry about that. It's got a pump charging handle on it, it's select fire, top-mounted magazine like this. It's essentially half of an original 1915 Villar Perosa with a shoulder stock stuck onto it. And the Italian army takes a look at that and says, yeah, this actually could make a lot of sense. We should adopt something like this. And that original Villar Perosa submachine gun convinces the Italian army to do some trials and to request designs for shoulder-fired submachine guns. And in 1917, they have such a request. They get half a dozen different submissions to the army for submachine guns. And the best of them is this guy submitted by the Beretta company and designed by a guy named Tullio Marangoni, who is responsible for a bunch of Beretta's early pistols as well. All the early Beretta pistols are Marangoni designs. What Marangoni does on this is actually really pretty clever and interesting. He makes this as cheaply and efficiently as possible by combining the receiver and an almost unmodified bolt mechanism from the 1915 Villar Perosa with the bayonet from a Carcano folding bayonet carbine, and he takes stocks and stock hardware from surplus Vetterli rifles. So that's why this has this funky trigger guard on it, is because it's actually made from an old Vetterli stock. Doing that allows Marangoni to make this a very economical and very quick to produce gun because lots of the complicated components are already there. It's just a matter of assembling them together into this format. The other interesting thing that he does is make this semi-automatic only. It fires from an open bolt, but only semi-auto. Later on, there would be a dual trigger version manufactured in Brescia, but that's actually really very scarce compared to these, and it's not the original design. Originally, it's just semi-auto. I think it's interesting that in World War I here, we're early enough in everything that people haven't necessarily concluded that full auto is the proper solution for a submachine gun, that a semi-auto, 25 round capacity, very light recoiling little carbine could be totally effective just on its own. So the Italian army tests a bunch of their submachine gun submissions. They end up choosing the Beretta here as the best one. It's designated the model of 1918 and it goes into production in late 1918. Now, before we talk about the production and where they went, let's take a closer look and let's take this one apart so you can see how it actually works. All right, let's dig into this guy. Let's start with some markings. There aren't many, but we do have Pietro Beretta Brescia back here on this receiver cover. And we have a serial number, which you'll see a little more clearly when we pull the stock off, that is 103. And that's it for markings. As for controls, we have our bolt handle here This sort of reddish fiber, I think it's a fiber or bakelite pad, survives on the bottom, but the top one has broken off. This is just the bolt handle from an original 1915 Villar Perosa. They just reused that, all of the internal parts. It does fire from an open bolt, so when I cock it, it locks open like that. When I pull the trigger, it's going to drop forward, fire, reset itself, and lock open until I pull the trigger a second time. We have a magazine release here at the front that is a little unconventional. You lift the magazine latch up, and then the magazine actually, this is a tail-in rock forward style of magazine. So to remove it, you pull it backwards and then lift out. We have a magazine locking lug there and one there. So again, goes in at the back, locks forward like so. Capacity is 25 rounds. This one is missing its spring and follower, in fact, but you get the idea. This is a standard 1915 Villar Perosa magazine, so double stack, double feed, and it is chambered for 9mm Glisenti, but this is actually chambered for an up-powered version of 9mm Glisenti, being the sort of PCC / submachine gun version. It doesn't need to be reduced load to work safely in a pistol. It's a simple blowback bolt action, or a simple blowback system. And so they actually scaled up the power of the cartridge to the point that it is essentially indistinguishable from 9mm Parabellum. So a lot of question and debate over the chambering of some of these guns. Essentially, it's just in 9mm Parabellum. It's Glisenti plus P, which is both dimensionally and performance-wise identical to 9mm Parabellum. So feed is in the top. This guy is just an ejection port cover, or an ejection tube, I guess, to ensure that cases don't get stuck in the gun, I guess. This looks like a magwell from the outside, but it's not. It's just for the ejection port. We have a Carcano folding bayonet on the front, and it's interesting that this is the early pattern of Carcano folding bayonet, where instead of having a spring-loaded button, it's got this lever. So flip the lever down, you can then pull the bayonet backwards, flip it out, lock it back in, push the lever up, and your bayonet is locked in place. This is not a particularly great locking system, which is why on the Carcano, they got rid of it in favor of a spring-loaded button to release the bayonet, but the 1918 Berettas were all made before that change took place. Now, because the magazine is centered in the top of the gun, the sights have to be offset. They chose to offset them to the right side, and just barely. So this is our rear V-notch sight, and then the front sight is just essentially bolted into the same bracket that originally had a Carcano front sight, but it is offset to the right by the same amount. These sights are practically usable both left and right-handed. Left-handed, you have to roll your head just a little bit over the side of the stock to use them, but they are very much usable, more so than a lot of offset sights that I've seen on other guns. And then really the only other element to mention down here is this fanciful trigger guard, which, like I said, is that way because this is an old Vetterli part. They just used what was already available. Same goes for the buttstock, the sling attachment, the butt plate. That serial number is off of a Vetterli. That is not a Villar Perosa, or not a Beretta 1918 serial number. At least I don't think it is, because the action's marked 103. So let's move on to disassembly. We're going to start by removing this pin, screw, that locks the rear plug of the receiver in place. So next up, I unscrew this rear plug. I actually have to lower this screw just a bit, or the rear plug will interfere with it. So we'll drop that down just a bit there. Now, there is a recoil spring under tension in here, so I want to hold on to this so it doesn't go flying once it's all the way unscrewed. There we go. So we've got our receiver plug and guide rod, our short little Villar Perosa spring. Then in order to take the bolt out, I have to take this piece off, which is actually very simple. this just slides off the back of the receiver. Just a little sheet metal piece that is simply there so that the bolt doesn't come out the back of the receiver. And with it out, we can pull that out like so. This is standard Villar Perosa bolt. The firing pin is a separate element there. The recoil spring nests inside the base of the firing pin like that when the whole thing is assembled. This is actually not a totally simple blowback system. It does have a very slight mechanical delay because of this angle back here. So when you fire, pressure pushes back on the bolt face, which is going to push this backwards, but it can't just travel backwards. It first has to rotate up. So it's going to cam up against that angled surface using this angled surface on the bolt right there. And that gives it just enough delay to keep the bolt relatively light, but function safely. In full auto, the Villar Perosas fire at a very high rate of fire because they do have a pretty slim delay and a pretty light bolt. But of course, this is semi-auto, so it fires once per trigger pull. Last thing we can do here is take off the front sling swivel. This has this little nut on it. We'll pull that off, and we can pull the nose cap off. The hand guard comes off. Take out the trigger guard. There we go. 2 screws there and a backing plate. And then I can lift the action out of the stock. Not much to the stock, just some inletting for the trigger, inletting there for the ejection port, and inletting for the bayonet. I suppose we can go one more step here and take the trigger mechanism off. Unscrew that. There's our trigger mechanism. This is actually marked Beretta. This would probably be one of the most significant single elements that they had to actually manufacture for the guns. So it's a semi-auto trigger with a disconnector. And then you've got this lug hanging off the bottom of the receiver that it bolts onto. There's the hole where the sear lifts up into the middle of the receiver tube. And it's going to lock into this, just like that. So spring is pushing the bolt forward. When the sear drops, right there, it allows the bolt to go forward, and it then pops back up so that it locks the bolt when it recoils. And there you are. There is a stripped down Beretta 1918 semi-auto carbine. It's interesting that to start production on these guns, the Italian army gave Beretta 5,000 1915 Villar Perosas to work with, because this is based on a Villar Perosa receiver and bolt assembly. So Beretta gets the old guns, they start chopping the receivers apart and fitting them with Vetterli stocks and Carcano bayonets and all of the other accoutrements, setting them up with sights. And they don't manage to finish. They get about half of them done. So 5,000 Villar Perosas, they get 2,000 or 2,500 of them converted into 4,000 or 5,000 of these guns by the time World War I ends in November of 1918. At that point, the Italian government cancels the contract. This happened to a lot of small arms projects at the end of World War I. And then interestingly, the Italian government sets up a commission to study the effectiveness and the desirability of submachine guns, pistol caliber stuff in general. And really interesting, they end up coming to the conclusion that they ought to develop an intermediate caliber cartridge. And we'll touch on one of those developments in a subsequent video, because I've got a Tierney 1921 that we're going to do some filming on coming up here. So no more of these are produced after the war. A couple of different things end up happening to them. So first off, a bunch of these are converted into Beretta 1918/30 semi-auto carbines in the early 1930s. You may be familiar with those. Some of those have actually gotten onto the collector's markets in the US and other places. They're notable for having a big ring cocking lever on the back, and they were converted to fire from closed bolt. The bolt mechanisms are a bit different. It's a substantial redesign, but those guns get used by police forces, and that's responsible for a lot of the existing 1918s, that conversion. The ones that aren't converted are mostly sold as surplus. Some of them go to Saudi Arabia, some of them actually go to Ethiopia, which ironically, the Italians will come back to Ethiopia in 1935, 1936. They will actually recapture a substantial stock, well, as substantial as any stockpile of these ever got. They'll recapture a bunch of them, put them back into Italian military service, and actually use a few of them in 1940 in North Africa during World War II. So these are now extremely rare today because there weren't that many made to begin with. A bunch of them are converted to 1918/30s. The ones that aren't either basically are worn out in Ethiopia or are destroyed during World War II during Italian use. So this particular one, pretty much, I think most of the known surviving examples actually did come back out of Ethiopia. There have been a bunch of guns exported out of Ethiopia in the last few years, and they included more 1918 Berettas than I think had existed anywhere else before that. So very cool to get a chance to take a look at this one. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.